She saved me a seat before we ever spoke. A stranger's hand on empty velvet, waiting for no one but me. I sat down. She smiled like she already knew my name. 3 months later. I was hiding her number from my own mother. 6 months later. I was choosing between her and everything I'd built. Because the girl from the theater wasn't just a stranger. She was the secret my whole family was about to inherit. And I didn't find that out until it was almost too late. My name is Maren Hale. 26 years old. A graphic designer living in Chicago. 3 years out of art school and still learning who I actually was underneath all my careful plans. I grew up in a small house outside Peoria where love looked one specific way. And I had spent my whole life quietly making sure I fit inside that shape. It was a Tuesday in October when I walked into the Lyric Theater alone, holding a single ticket my coworker couldn't use, expecting nothing more than 2 hours of distraction. The lobby smelled like old velvet and fresh coffee, and I remember feeling strangely exposed, like everyone could tell I'd come by myself on purpose. I found row 8. Seat 12. And there was already a coat draped over it, a single leather glove resting on top like a small, deliberate flag. A woman in a green cardigan looked up at me and said, without apology, that she'd been saving that seat, and asked if I'd mind sitting beside her instead. I didn't mind. I told her I didn't mind. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me more than her request did. Her name was Josephine, she said. Though everyone who mattered called her Jo. And she had a way of saying my name back like she was testing how it fit in her mouth. We didn't talk much before the curtain rose. Just small comments about the program notes. But something about her attention felt like sunlight through a window I didn't know was dirty. During intermission she bought 2 coffees without asking what I wanted, then handed me the one with cream, correctly guessing I didn't take mine black. I asked how she knew. She said she'd been watching me since I sat down, and that people who overthink small talk usually want their coffee gentle. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly from nerves. And she watched me laugh like it was the best part of her whole evening. When the show ended, she asked if I came to that theater often, and I admitted I'd never been brave enough to come alone until tonight. She said bravery was underrated and that most people confused it with recklessness, then asked if I'd like to grab a drink at the bar next door. I said yes before I'd fully decided to. The way you agree to jump into cold water only after your feet are already leaving the dock. At the bar. She told me she worked in theater production. Vague about specifics. And I told her about client logos and font choices, feeling suddenly ordinary beside her. She disagreed. She said ordinary things done with care were the rarest kind of art. And I felt something unclench in my chest that had been tight for years. We stayed until closing, trading stories about hometowns and terrible first jobs. And I noticed I hadn't checked my phone once the entire night. When she walked me to my car, she didn't ask for my number outright. She asked if she could text me sometime, which felt like a small and careful kindness. I gave her my number and watched her walk away under the streetlights, already replaying the sound of her laugh before I'd even started the engine. That night I lay awake longer than I wanted to admit, turning her name over like a coin I wasn't ready to spend yet. Jo texted me the next morning, a single line asking if the coffee had done its job, and I answered faster than any rule of dating etiquette allowed. We started talking every day after that. First about small things, then about the things people usually save for much later, like fear and family and old griefs. She told me about her father's diner in Cleveland, closed years ago, and how she still measured every good meal against his cooking without meaning to. I told her about my father's silence, how he expressed love through fixed gutters and mowed lawns instead of words, and she said that sounded lonelier than I probably realized. 2 weeks in, she invited me to see her at work. And I realized then that Jo wasn't behind the scenes of theater production. She was on stage in a supporting role, watching her perform, confident and luminous under stage lights. I understood why she'd noticed a nervous stranger sitting alone. She was someone who paid attention for a living. Afterward, backstage, She introduced me to castmates as her friend from the theater, and something in me flinched softly at the word, though I couldn't yet say why. We started meeting for lunch between her rehearsals and my design deadlines, stealing 40 minutes at a diner that made coffee almost as bad as the company was good. One rainy afternoon she reached across the table and wiped a smear of ketchup from the corner of my mouth, and neither of us pretended that gesture was purely practical. I found myself dressing differently on the days I knew I'd see her. Small choices I told myself were coincidence, though my roommate noticed and said nothing. Kindly. A month in, Jo admitted she'd noticed me before that Tuesday night, at a coffee shop near my office, and had simply worked up the nerve to sit near me at the theater. That confession rearranged something in my chest. The meeting I'd believed was chance had actually been someone choosing me on purpose, quietly. For weeks beforehand, I asked her why she hadn't just said hello at the coffee shop, and she said she'd been terrified I'd turn out to be exactly the kind of straight girl who'd break her heart politely. I didn't correct her assumption in that moment, mostly because I still wasn't sure myself what I was or wasn't, and the not knowing scared me more than she did. That night, walking home, I let myself replay every time a friendship with a woman had felt like something more. Memories I'd filed away under different names for years. I called my college roommate, the only person who'd ever seen me almost say it out loud, and told her about Jo without using any label at all. She listened, then asked gently if I was finally ready to stop performing certainty I didn't feel, a question that sat with me for days afterward. Jo never pushed. She let our friendship stretch and deepen at whatever pace I could manage, which somehow made me trust her faster than pressure ever could have. On a night we watched an old film at her apartment, our hands found each other on the couch, and neither of us moved them away for a long while. She finally asked if she could kiss me, quietly, without drama. The way you ask permission for something you already suspect the answer to. I said yes. And when it happened, something in me that had been holding its breath for 26 years finally, quietly, exhaled. We didn't call it anything at first. Just two women who kept ending up in the same kitchen, the same bed, the same unhurried mornings. I remember waking up in her apartment and feeling more like myself in that borrowed sunlight than I had in any bedroom I'd ever called mine. Jo made pancakes badly and confidently, singing off-key to the radio, and I thought, with sudden clarity, that I could love this exact scene for the rest of my life. I still hadn't told anyone what we were. Partly from fear. Partly because naming it felt like handing the world a weapon it hadn't earned yet. My mother called that week, asking, as she always did, whether I'd met anyone, and I said not really, hating the ease with which the lie arrived. Jo asked me directly one evening if I was ashamed of her, and I said no immediately, then spent the rest of the night wondering if that had been fully true. She told me she'd come out to her family at 19, badly, in anger, and had spent years repairing what that explosion had cost her relationship with her mother. She said she didn't want that history repeating with me, that she'd rather I take my time than blow up my life the way she'd blown up hers. That patience felt like a gift, but it also felt like a debt quietly accumulating, one I knew I'd eventually have to pay in full. My brother Caleb visited Chicago that month, and I introduced Jo as my roommate's friend, watching her play along with a grace that made my chest ache with guilt. Later, alone, Caleb asked if there was something between us, his voice careful, not accusing, just genuinely curious in a way I wasn't prepared for. I denied it too quickly, and he studied me the way he used to when we were kids and I'd broken something and blamed the dog. Weeks passed in a kind of golden secrecy, Jo's apartment becoming the only place I felt fully unclenched, fully honest, fully unwatched by anyone's expectations. Then Jo landed her first lead role, a modern reimagining of an old classic, and the local paper started printing her photo alongside glowing early reviews. With visibility came risk. She asked if I'd come to opening night, publicly, as her date. And the question hung between us like a held breath. I hesitated, and she saw the hesitation land. Her face doing that small practice thing where disappointment gets folded neatly and put away for later. I told her I needed time, and she said time was fine. But time had a way of becoming an answer even when you didn't mean it as one. That week my mother called again, this time mentioning that Tyler, my old boyfriend from high school, had asked about me at a church function. She said it lightly, the way she always introduced possibilities she wanted me to consider. And something in me went cold and obedient the way it always had. I hadn't thought about Tyler in years, but hearing his name felt like a door creaking open onto a version of my life I'd almost escaped. That night I dreamed of the wedding my mother had always narrated for me. White dress, small church, a life indistinguishable from every woman I'd grown up beside. I woke up beside Joe, who was still asleep, sunlight on her collarbone, and felt the dream and the reality collide painfully somewhere behind my ribs. I didn't go to opening night. I told Joe I had a family obligation, which was technically true, though the family obligation was really my own cowardice. She didn't argue. She simply said, quietly, that she understood, in a tone that made it clear she didn't. Not really. Not the way she wanted to. I watched the performance from the very back row instead. Alone. Hidden. Clapping for a woman I loved from a distance I'd chosen for myself. Afterward, I saw her hug her castmates, her family, everyone who'd shown up proudly, while I slipped out the side door before she could see me at all. I told myself I was protecting her, protecting us. But the truth felt more like I was protecting the comfortable lie I still lived inside. Joe texted the next morning asking if I'd made it to the show, and I lied again. Said I hadn't been able to get away, and hated myself instantly. 2 days later, a photo from opening night surfaced online, a wide shot of the crowd, and there I was, unmistakably, sitting in the back row. Joe saw it before I could explain, and when she called, her voice wasn't angry, just tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who's been quietly betrayed before. She asked why I'd lied about something so small, and I realized, saying it out loud, that nothing about it had actually been small at all. I confessed everything then. My mother's expectations, Tyler's resurfacing name, my fear of the word people would eventually use to describe me and her together. Joe listened without interrupting, then said the hardest thing wasn't loving her. It was loving myself enough to stop apologizing for it in advance. I didn't have an answer for that. I just cried. The kind of crying that comes from years of pressure finally finding one small crack. She held me anyway. Even angry. Even tired. Because she said love wasn't conditional on the other person having already finished becoming brave. We didn't break up that night. But something shifted. A quiet clock starting somewhere neither of us could see, counting down toward a decision I hadn't made yet. My mother invited me home for Thanksgiving, casually mentioning that Tyler's family would be at the same church potluck, an old tradition dressed up as coincidence. I told Joe about the invitation, and she asked, plainly, whether I planned to bring her, or whether I planned to disappear into my old life for a weekend. I said I needed to go alone, just this once, to figure out how to tell my mother the truth without the whole family collapsing at once. Joe agreed, though her eyes carried a wariness I recognized, the look of someone who had heard just this once become forever before. Driving to Peoria, I rehearsed sentences in my head, opening lines for a conversation I'd been avoiding since I was 17 years old. The house looked exactly the same. Same porch light. Same cracked front step my father never got around to fixing. Same smell of my mother's cooking. Dinner was normal at first. Small talk about work and weather. Until my mother mentioned Tyler again, asking if I'd consider giving him another chance. I said, quietly, that I wasn't interested in Tyler, that I hadn't been for a long time, and something in my tone made her set down her fork. she asked, carefully. If there was someone else. And I felt the whole kitchen tilt slightly, like the moment before a car goes into a skid. I said yes. There was someone. And before I could stop myself, I said her name. Jo. Out loud. In my mother's kitchen. For the first time. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt endless. My mother's face cycling through confusion, then understanding, then something harder to name. She asked if I was saying what she thought I was saying, and I nodded. My hands shaking under the table where she couldn't see them. My father said nothing, just stood and started clearing plates, the way he always retreated into small tasks when a moment got too large for him. My mother said she needed time, that this wasn't something she could just accept over dinner, and asked me to leave before things got said that couldn't be unsaid. I drove back to Chicago that same night, crying so hard I had to pull over twice, replaying her face in the rearview mirror of my mind. Jo opened her door before I even knocked, like she'd sensed something was wrong through the walls, and just wrapped her arms around me without asking a single question. I told her everything, and she held me through it, though I could feel her own fear underneath her calm, the fear of loving someone whose family might not survive it. For a week, my mother didn't call, and the silence felt heavier than any argument could have. A verdict delivered without a single word spoken. Caleb called instead, saying our mother had told him everything, and asked, gently, if I was happy. A question no one else in my family had thought to ask. I told him yes. More honestly than I'd told anyone anything in years, and he said that was all that had ever mattered to him. He confessed then that he'd suspected for a while, not from anything I'd said, but from the way I talked about Jo without meaning to. Jo's career, meanwhile, was accelerating. The play was extending its run, and producers from a regional theater circuit began attending performances to scout her. One evening she came home glowing, saying a producer named Marcus Feld wanted to discuss a touring contract that could take the show to 3 other cities. I was thrilled for her. Genuinely. Though a small selfish voice inside me quietly calculated how many months that tour might keep us apart. She noticed my hesitation and asked if the timing scared me, and I admitted it did. Not because I doubted her, but because I doubted my own newfound stability. She promised nothing would happen without us talking it through together, and for a while, that promise felt like enough to hold the fear at bay. Then my mother finally called, her voice tight but civil, asking if I would come home again, alone, to talk properly instead of over a rushed dinner. I went, nervous but hopeful, and found her sitting at the kitchen table with an old photo album open, something she hadn't shown me in years. She pointed to a black and white photo of a young woman I didn't recognize, standing close beside my grandmother, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She told me that woman's name was Ruth, my grandmother's closest friend for 30 years, though the way she said friend carried a weight I suddenly understood completely. My mother said she'd always suspected the truth about Ruth and her mother, but no one in that generation had the language, or the courage, to say it aloud. She said watching me say Jo's name at dinner had cracked something open in her. Memories of watching her own mother hide happiness for decades. She wasn't ready to celebrate, she admitted. But she was ready to stop pretending she didn't understand exactly what I'd been trying to tell her. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a door left slightly open instead of slammed shut. And I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had in months. Back in Chicago, I told Jo about Ruth, about my grandmother, about the photograph that had apparently been hiding an entire unspoken history in plain sight. Jo said quietly that every family had a Ruth somewhere, a hidden love folded into old photographs, waiting for someone brave enough to ask questions. For a while, things felt almost easy. My mother calling more often, Jo's play thriving, our small apartment life settling into something I hadn't dared imagine before. Then Marcus Feld's touring offer became official, 6 months on the road. Starting in February. An opportunity Jo had worked her whole career toward. She sat me down to talk about it properly, saying she wouldn't take it if it meant losing what we'd finally built together after everything. I told her I would never ask her to give up her career for me, even as some smaller, frightened part of me wanted exactly that. We talked about long distance, about video calls and stolen weekends, trying to convince ourselves the math of 6 months apart could somehow still add up to us. My old friend from art school, Priya, warned me over coffee that long distance rarely survived a career on the rise meeting a life still standing still. I didn't tell Jo what Priya had said, but the words lodged somewhere uncomfortable, a splinter I kept accidentally pressing on when I couldn't sleep. Jo accepted the tour contract, and we spent the weeks before her departure trying to compress a lifetime of ordinary days into borrowed, urgent evenings. The night before she left, we didn't sleep at all. Just talked, made promises, memorized each other's faces like we were studying for an exam neither of us could fail. At the airport, she held my face in both hands and said this wasn't an ending, just a strange, temporary shape our love would have to learn to hold. I watched her walk through security until she disappeared, then sat in my car in the parking garage and cried until I had nothing left to give it. The first month of the tour, we talked every night. Her voice tired but warm through the phone, describing new cities I'd never seen in person. By the second month, the calls grew shorter, interrupted more often by rehearsals, press events, and the general exhaustion of a body performing 8 shows a week. I threw myself into work, taking on extra design clients to fill the silence, though the silence had a way of following me home regardless. My mother, unexpectedly, became someone I talked to more during that stretch, asking careful questions about Jo, slowly learning the shape of the relationship she'd once resisted. One night she asked if I was lonely, and I admitted, for the first time to her, that missing someone this much felt almost unbearable. She said that sounded like real love, the kind worth protecting. A sentence that stunned me coming from the same woman who'd once asked me to leave her kitchen. Meanwhile, a name began appearing more often in Jo's stories, a fellow actor named Camille, cast opposite her as the tour's romantic lead in the show. Jo mentioned Camille casually at first, funny anecdotes from rehearsal, but over weeks the anecdotes multiplied, and something small and cold began forming in my stomach. I told myself I trusted her completely, and mostly I did. But distance has a way of turning ordinary silence into elaborate, unwanted stories. One night Jo called later than usual, laughing about an after-show dinner with the cast, and in the background I clearly heard Camille's voice, warm and familiar. Asked, as casually as I could manage, whether Camille was someone I should know more about, and Jo's pause lasted one beat too long. She admitted Camille had been flirtatious, that she gently redirected it more than once, and that she hadn't mentioned it because she didn't want to worry me unnecessarily. I told her I would rather worry than be kept in the dark, and she apologized, though the apology didn't fully dissolve the knot forming in my chest. For the first time since she'd left, I felt the distance not as a temporary shape but as a widening crack neither of us had planned for. I flew out for a surprise weekend visit during her tour stop in Nashville, wanting to remind us both what we were actually fighting to hold on to. I arrived at her hotel to find Camille leaving Jo's room late in the evening, laughing. Casual. The kind of ease that only comes from genuine closeness. Jo explained they'd been running lines for a scene change, and the explanation was reasonable, logical, entirely plausible, and yet something in me didn't fully believe it. We argued that night, quietly, in a hotel room meant for reunion instead of conflict, both of us saying things sharpened by months of unspoken worry. I accused her of letting the distance change her priorities, and she accused me of never fully choosing her, of always keeping one foot in my old life. The accusation landed harder than I expected, because some small, honest part of me knew it wasn't entirely untrue. Not yet. Not completely. I flew home early the next morning, and for 2 weeks after, our calls turned formal, careful. Both of us circling the argument instead of resolving it. My mother, of all people, called during that stretch and asked directly if something was wrong, and I finally admitted the whole relationship felt like it was slipping. She said something I didn't expect, that love surviving distance required more than trust. It required both people actively choosing each other. Out loud. Again and again, I realized I hadn't said, out loud, in a long time, exactly what Joe meant to me, and that silence had left room for doubt to grow unchecked. I called her that night, not to argue, but to say, plainly, that I loved her, that I was scared, and that I didn't want distance to win. She cried on the phone, saying she'd been terrified I was already halfway gone, using the Camille situation as proof she wasn't worth fighting for. We talked for hours that night. Really talked. The kind of conversation that repairs more than it reopens. Both of us finally saying the unsaid things. She told me Camille had eventually stopped the flirtation entirely after Joe made it clear, firmly, that her heart already belonged somewhere very specific. I believed her. Not because the doubt vanished completely, but because I chose, deliberately, the way my mother had described, to trust the person I loved. The tour's final stretch brought them back toward Chicago for a 2-week engagement, and I counted the days like a child counting toward a holiday. The night before her return, my mother called and asked, hesitantly, if she and my father could come to opening night in Chicago, to finally meet Joe properly. I nearly dropped the phone, stunned that the woman who'd once sent me away from her table now wanted a seat at this new chapter. Opening night arrived, and I stood backstage watching my parents settle into seats beside Caleb, an image I would have called impossible only a year earlier. Joe performed that night like she'd been saving something extra for exactly this audience, and I watched my mother's face soften more with every act. After the curtain call, my mother approached Joe directly, her hands trembling slightly, and said simply that she was sorry it had taken her this long to show up. Joe, gracious as always, said showing up at all mattered more than the timing, and hugged my mother like they'd known each other for years. My father, quiet as ever, shook Joe's hand and said her performance had made him cry, which from him was practically a full autobiography. That night felt like a turning point, not an ending to the difficulty, but proof that the difficulty could bend without breaking everything inside it. 2 weeks later, the tour ended, and Joe moved back into our apartment permanently, both of us slowly relearning how to share ordinary days again. Just as things steadied, Joe received a call from Marcus Feld with an offer that would change everything again. A lead role in a Broadway-bound production. The catch was brutal. Rehearsals in New York starting in 6 weeks, meaning Joe would need to relocate almost immediately if she accepted the part. She told me about it hesitantly, clearly torn, saying she wouldn't take it without discussing what it meant for the life we'd only just rebuilt. I told her, honestly, that I couldn't ask her to turn down the biggest opportunity of her career, just to protect my own fear of change. We spent nights mapping out options, me potentially freelancing remotely from New York, her potentially declining, neither option feeling entirely fair to either of us. My boss, Richard Voss, unexpectedly offered a possible solution, saying our design firm had been discussing opening a small satellite office in New York for over a year. He asked if I'd be willing to help lead that expansion. A genuine promotion disguised conveniently as perfect timing, I almost didn't believe was real. I told Joe about the offer, and for the first time in months, I watched real, uncomplicated hope spread across her face instead of worry. We decided together, deliberately, out loud, the way my mother had once described, to move to New York and build the next chapter side by side. Packing up our Chicago apartment felt bittersweet. folding up the small kitchen where I'd first felt entirely myself into cardboard boxes headed somewhere new. My mother helped us pack, insisting on wrapping dishes herself, chatting easily with Joe about curtain styles like they were simply mother and daughter-in-law. The word daughter-in-law, unspoken but clearly implied, hung comfortably in the air that day, and neither of us corrected the quiet assumption. On our last night in Chicago, we returned to the Lyric Theater, sitting in the same row, the same seats. 1 year after the coat and the glove, "Yo loghead," saying she couldn't believe a saved seat had turned into an entire relocation, an entire family reshaped, an entire life redirected. I told her it wasn't the seat that had done it. It was her decision to notice me at all. Weeks before that night, at a coffee shop, New York greeted us with chaos, tiny apartments, subway confusion, and Joe's rehearsals stretching long into the night as the Broadway production ramped up. My satellite office launch kept me equally busy, but every evening we found each other again in our small kitchen, tired but undeniably, deliberately together. 3 months in, a familiar name resurfaced. Camille had also been cast in the New York production, a coincidence that made my stomach tighten instinctively. This time, though, Joe told me immediately, unprompted, before I could even ask, saying she wasn't going to let old fear repeat old damage. We had dinner with Camille together, deliberately, and I watched any lingering tension dissolve into something almost like friendship, built on honesty instead of secrecy. Camille later confided to me privately that she genuinely respected how Joe had handled everything, choosing clarity over convenience, even when convenience would have been easier. Opening night on Broadway arrived on a cold February evening, my parents flying and specially, Caleb bringing his boyfriend, a relationship he'd finally stopped hiding too. That revelation stunned me more than almost anything else that year. Learning my own brother had been quietly waiting for permission that my own courage had granted him. Joe's performance that night was extraordinary, and during the curtain call, she scanned the audience until she found me, holding my gaze for one long, deliberate second. Afterward, at the reception, Marcus Feld pulled me aside and said, half joking, that half the cast credited me with keeping their star grounded and steady. My mother, standing nearby, overheard and said, proudly, that keeping people steady had always been my quiet talent, even when I hadn't believed it myself. Later that night, back in our apartment, Joe knelt down without ceremony. No elaborate speech, just her steady eyes and a small ring she'd apparently carried for weeks. She said she didn't need a stage or an audience for the most important line of her life. She just needed me to say yes. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence, laughing and crying at once, the same way I had at that first ridiculous joke in the theater lobby. We called my mother immediately, and instead of hesitation, I heard genuine joy in her voice, the sound of someone who had finally, fully arrived somewhere new. Caleb texted a string of exclamation points, and even my father, quiet as ever, sent a message simply saying he was proud of me. We were married the following spring in a small backyard ceremony in Peoria. Of all places, my grandmother's old photograph of Ruth displayed quietly on the gift table. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, and afterward admitted she'd finally understood Ruth's photograph wasn't a secret to bury, but a love worth honoring. Joe's Broadway run extended twice, and I built our New York office into a small but thriving branch, both of us finally standing steady in our own lives. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, we still argue gently about who noticed whom first, the coffee shop or the theater, refusing to fully settle the debate. What I know for certain is that a stranger once saved me a seat I didn't ask for, and then quietly, patiently, saved the rest of my life too. I used to think courage meant loud declarations, but I learned it was really just choosing the same person. Honestly. Again and again. Every single day. That choice, made 1,000 small times since that night at the Lyric Theater, has become the steadiest, truest thing I have ever built. Fendi.